Malaysia meningkat kepada 4.5% tahun lalu, iaitu kadar tertinggi dalam tempoh 27 tahun.
Introduction to Macroeconomics. Macroeconomics. Macroeconomics studies a country's or region's overall economy. It focuses on economy-wide events such as total goods and service produced, unemployment, and pricing behavior. Macroeconomics explores how consumers and corporations make decisions. Microeconomics focuses on the aggregate decision. Macroeconomics use aggregate indicators like gross domestic product, GDP, unemployment rates, and the Consumer Price Index, CPI, to investigate the large-scale ramifications of micro-level decisions. Unemployment. Unemployment refers to the number of people who can work but are not working or not having suitable jobs and looking for other jobs.
There are 6 types of unemployment, which are frictional unemployment, cyclical unemployment, structural unemployment, technological unemployment, seasonal unemployment, and hidden unemployment. First, residual unemployment. In all societies, there is an element of residual unemployment because there will always be people who are virtually unemployable on a permanent basis. There are people who find it difficult or impossible to cope with the demand of modern production methods and the disciplines of organized work. Second, frictional unemployment. Frictional unemployment is short-term unemployment and results from normal turnover in the economy. Frictional unemployment occurs when people are in between jobs or are entering or re-entering the labour force. Some people voluntarily quit their job to look for other suitable employment. Third, structural unemployment. This type of unemployment arises due to change in the structure of the economy. It is related to occupational movement or mobility. Structural unemployment occurs when workers lack of the necessary skill for jobs that are available or have particular skills that are no longer in demand. Next, cyclical unemployment. Some joblessness may result from short-term cyclical fluctuation in the economy. This is known as cyclical or demand deficiency unemployment. It happens when firms have to retain some workers in response to fall in aggregate demand during a recession. Next, hidden unemployment. This refers to people who are actually employed but are not productive. Hidden unemployment is quite common in traditional agriculture where several family members work on a small plot of land. The last one is seasonal unemployment. Seasonal unemployment is the type of unemployment that can be predicted to recur periodically. According to the time of year, it usually affects workers in agriculture, occupation, education, and some other industries. There is usually little concern over this unemployment because it can be planned for, which means it is part of the job.
Inflation. Inflation is a situation where there is a persistent and rapid increase in the general price level, which is Consumer Price Index.
There are 3 types of inflation, which are demand pull inflation, cost push inflation, and built-in inflation. First, demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation can be defined as an in general price level due to an excess aggregate demand over aggregate supply at or near the full employment level of output. If the economy is operating at less than full employment, any increase of aggregate demand will be met by an increase in output. However, as the economy is approaching or at the full employment output level, firms cannot respond to increase in aggregate demand by increasing the output. Therefore, they respond to increase in aggregate demand by increasing the price level. Next, cost push inflation. This is an increase in the general price level caused by an increase in the cost of production and other factors that can cause the aggregate supply to decrease. This inflation will remain forever unless the government undertakes anti-inflationary measures to increase the aggregate supply. The last one is built-in inflation. Built-in inflation is related to adaptive expectation, the idea that people expect current inflation rates to continue in the future as the price of goods and services rise. Workers and others come to expect that they will continue to rise in the future at a similar rate and demand more costs or wish to maintain their standard of living.
How is the situation of inflation and unemployment for both countries, Malaysia and Singapore? Firstly, we would look on inflation in Malaysia. The inflation rate in Malaysia for the year 2020 is at negative 1.14%. The various factors at play are illustrated in this figure. This figure shows that the consumer prices in domestic is influenced by the commodity price that affected from the global demand and supply condition. The demand for many key commodities has significantly decreased as a result of the pandemic. However, export limits become disruptions in export logistics, which led to an increase in the price of food commodities. Strict movement restrictions have also caused considerable supply disruption since the start of the pandemic, which contributed to some price pressures for particular perishable food products. Inflation has been impacted by the legal implementation of health-related regulatory measures as well. The government had put in place sector-specific Standard Operating Procedure (SOP) in addition to prevent the virus spread. The government has also put into effort of cost-cutting measures that have lessened inflationary pressures. Since the start of the pandemic, Malaysia has generally had the modest inflationary pressures, which is consistent with other nations' experiences and is partly attributable to low global oil prices. Since then, the IMF has lowered its prediction of inflation in 2020, citing a combination of declining commodity prices and slower economic growth as the main causes. Next, unemployment rate in Malaysia recorded the highest in 5 years, which is 4.55% in 2020. The labor market has been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. According to the Department of Statistics Malaysia, the unemployment rate increased from 3.3% to 4.5% in 2020. These effects were seen in practically all industries in Malaysia. The following are the top 5 reasons why individuals working: to sustain cost of living, seeking attention, addressing pressure from one's surrounding peers, family and relatives, making one feeling comfortable, and the last one is having peace of mind by working. 2020 was a difficult year for the majority of nations in the globe. In addition to the airline industry, the pandemic also had an impact on a number of other businesses in Malaysia. The loss of employment in Malaysia for 2020 can be seen in this figure. The number of loss of employment has dramatically increased in the parallel with the introduction of Movement Control Order, or also known as MCO. It is also resulted that most affected industry is manufacturing industry, wholesales and retails industries, and the accommodation and food and beverage sectors. The main reasons are downsizing 28%, business closure 25%, mutual separation scheme 23%, company financial problem 15%, and others by 9%. Next, we're going to see on inflation and unemployment in Singapore. The inflation rate in Singapore was resulted at negative 0.18% for the year 2020. Singapore's overall headline inflation rate actually decreased by 0.2% in 2020. This basically indicates that price decrease on average rather than rising in Singapore, which is what is known as deflation. A stated deflation does not always indicate that all prices decrease. In reality, this also indicated that prices overall decrease, yet there could have been certain costs that didn't decrease or even increase in price. Despite of the best efforts, Expenditure will grow over time as inflation drives up the cost of even the most basic daily essentials. Every year, the Singapore Department of Statistics keeps a record of price changes for major items and services that are a part of our daily life. So these are the list of categories that include in the record. Moreover, the unemployment rate in Singapore was recorded at 5.19% in 2020. Between 2019 and 2020, the unemployment rate climbed more among the non-PMETs than it did among the PMETs. The rates for both categories, however, have stayed below the earlier recessionary peaks. Because their long-term unemployment rates increased much less, the rise in unemployment rates for PMETs and non-PMETs was mostly caused by the short-term unemployment. Compared to the other age groups, PMETs in their 40s had a greater increase in the long-term unemployment rate. However, long-term unemployment rates among the non-PMETs increased for those who is under 30 and in their 40s, but remain stable for those who in their 50s and older. Due to reasons including the decline in tourist arrivals and the temporary suspensions of labor activities that must be performed on site, the increase in unemployment rate was greater in industries that were more seriously impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. The most impacted sectors are accommodation, other community, social and personal services, construction, retail trade, food and beverage services, education, and also administrative support. Meanwhile, the least impacted sectors are public administration and defense, professional service, and real estate services. Lastly, these are the reasons unemployment increased in 2020.
This section gives an update on the pandemic's effect on Malaysia consumer inflation. The first effect of inflation is increasing living expenses. Due to the pandemic initially, as a result of export limitations or producer supply restraints, the cost of food and other commodities and services increased. Next, a large number of employees leave employment. In Malaysia's statistics, citing concern about inflation, the job picture for yearly 2021 is likely largely bleak, with the majority of respondents predicting that job availability will either fall further or remain steady in the months ahead. Finally, during a pandemic, individuals will be extra cautious while making purchases. According to the most recent findings, only 13% of people plan to look for a home in the next 3 months, down from 15% a quarter ago. These are some effects of unemployment in Malaysia. The first effects of unemployment is departure from the labour force and unemployment. Quarterly figures trace out the job-displacing effects of economic closures and force to contain the pandemic. Malaysia's extensive lockdown is the first movement control order of March to June 2020, as resulted in staggering 17.1% GDP contraction in 2020. Correspondingly, overall unemployment rose from 3.2% in 2019 to 5.1% in 2020. The second is the income of young employees decreased. The steeper decline in employment among young people and those with lesser levels of education puts downward pressure on pay in the fields. Third, it increases the likelihood of mental illness. Being unemployed is likely to lead to a number of losses, including those to social relationships and financial security, and these losses may be stressful in and of themselves. Next, we move to the effects of inflation in Singapore. The increase in living expenditures unavoidably increases the burden on the typical person on the street. According to the Department of Statistics Singapore, the top 3 categories of expenditure for Singapore households are housing and utilized, which is 24%, food 21.1%, and transportation 17.1%. Next, Rate rises may also have an impact on bank lending rates. As a result, floating rate loans such as those seen in the most home loans may experience higher revisions. Lastly, sellers are bound in pricing for fear of losing customers. Businesses that are feeling the pinch from growing expenses are likely to be those with smaller market shares in highly competitive industry. They are unable to raise rates for fear of losing customers while dealing with COVID-19 regulations. Let's continue to our last part on the effects section. The first effect of unemployment in Singapore is mental health problems. In an in-depth research undertaken by Institute of Mental Health (IMH) to analyze the Singapore population's psychological reactions and mental well-being during the pandemic, over 20% of those polled reported feeling symptoms anxiety between May 2020 and June 2021. The second is incidents of crime are rising, with 19,444 instances recorded in the first half of this year, or an increase of 11% over the same period last year, which means crime increased in Singapore. Lastly, the economy of Singapore decreased. The COVID-19 has had a substantial negative influence on the Singaporean economy. International travel-dependent industries such as air transportation, lodging, and other tourism-related industries have been the most badly impacted. Retail and food services are two consumer-facing industries that have been severely impacted by the decline in domestic consumption and the ensuing higher self-distance regulations.
Hi, my name is Nur Umara Izzati binti Abdul Aziz. My matrices number is 2021476742. There is no problem without solution, right? All individual entities and even government should have initiative to reduce the inflation and unemployment in the country. Best way to reduce inflation and unemployment is by money and fiscal policy. Do you guys know what is money policy? Simplest way to define this term is central bank will control all supply money available to its banks, consumers and businesses so that the economic growth in the country maintained. How do actually monetary policy works? It's actually by increase the interest rate. For example, before this the interest rate of the rise is 7%, but after inflation the government will increase the interest rate to 12%. When this happens, the customer will take into account what's the most important things that they need to buy first. In short, higher interest rate will lower the demand. Increased interest rate will help reduce the growth of aggregate demand in the economy. Slower growth will then lead to lower inflation. Higher interest rate reduce consumer spending because increased interest rate increase the cost of borrowing. Then it will discouraging consumers from borrowing and spending. Okay, let's move to the next. Fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is what we will touch on tax. In this policy, government can increase the rate of taxes and cut the spending. This will reduce the aggregate demand. It will reduce the government borrowing, but it's likely to be politically costly as the public dislike higher taxes and cut to government spending. This shows that this policy is limited. How about unemployment? It's hard when you become one of the unemployment individuals during the pandemic COVID-19. The government will need to pursue expansionary fiscal policy as this involves cutting taxes and increase the government spending. Lower taxes increase disposable income and therefore help to increase consumption, leading to higher aggregate demand. Thus, higher aggregate demand and strong economic growth, fewer firms will go bankrupt, which is fewer job losses. Last but not least, by monetary policy. It is by cutting the interest rate. Lower rates decrease the cost of borrowing and encourage people to spend and invest more. This increase aggregate demand and should also help to increase GDP and furthermore, lower interest rate will reduce exchange rate that make exports more competitive.
In conclusion, we can state categorically that unemployment and inflation are related. The Philip curve explores this relationship, and its discovery must be regarded as one of macroeconomics' greatest achievements. Thank you.